so if I talk too softly, please let us know. But hi, how are you all? We're like nearing the end. I think we're at the last panel session of the experience. So well done in being able to make it to near the end. So give yourselves a big hand. And a huge thank you again to the forum for inviting us to be part of this, or the foundation to be part of it. We are really excited about having this conversation. I'll introduce myself and then quickly my panelists, but we are going to start with a little bit of formal, I don't know if presentation is the right word, but grounding. We thought it'd be helpful to give some context as to why we're having this conversation about repatterning the future. So I'll just jump in by saying, hi, I'm Nancy Giordano. I describe myself these days as an exponential strategist. I really do feel like the moment that we're in right now is quite unique, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So each step we take has an exponential impact. But last night when we were having cocktails, someone introduced me as a champion for the future, or cheerleader for the future. And I was like, huh. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm an advocate for the future, for sure. But I'm curious, who knows the concept of imaginal cells? Who's heard the concept of imaginal cells? Really? Oh my God, okay, good. I love turning people on to this. There is science recently about how caterpillars transform into butterflies. And the idea is that even as a caterpillar is nascent and just born and is beginning its life as a caterpillar, in it are dormant cells that you describe as imaginal cells or imaginal discs that hold the DNA for what will eventually be the butterfly's wings or the antennas or the whole structure of a butterfly. And as it starts getting closer and closer to metamorphosis, the cells start to increase in number and in potency, right? In capacity and in number. And the imaginal cells start to swarm the caterpillar in its original form and start to take over. And the caterpillar absolutely resists this process, like does not want to go into the gooey thing and like become something that it doesn't know that it will become. I describe my work these days as on the planet trying to increase the number and potency of imaginal cells that are helping lead the transformation and metamorphosis from this current era that we're in to the one that we can imagine is ahead. So with that, I appreciate that you all are part of our imaginal cell network right now and will enter this conversation with us. As part of my work, I'm very, very focused on a safe and thriving future for all. I'm very aligned on that, including as a mother, and my son is here as a young futurist who will be part of this work as he matures. And so I feel like everything is really tuned into that goal. Part of that was a frustration that women's voices were not often highlighted or quoted or as recognized in some of this work. So 4 or 5 years ago, my colleague and I started the Femme Futurist Society, which is really kind of a side hustle, but it's a podcast in which we get to go interview amazing women that are doing work that is shaping and building the future. So 2 of my favorites are with us here. 2 recent interviews are with Ila Colombo and Monika Bielskyte. And as we were thinking about this panel, I thought their work is a perfect representation of what it means to repattern the future, right? And when we start to think about the systems that we've been inherited from eras in the past, are they the ones that are holding up, and how can we think about these differently? So with that, I will jump into sort of the slides, but all good? Again, it'll be a little formal at the beginning, then we'll have some discussion. We would love for you guys to participate in this in some way. It's a really intimate space, even though it's a larger room, and so think about your questions. There will be mic runners who can be part of that. And if you feel like you just are urgent and need to do it before we're ready, just lift your hand. This is we're sort of repatterning panels as well as we go through this right now. So we have the opportunity to ask each other questions, jump in various ways. I will try and manage time. And do you guys see the clock?
I see start, maybe.
You see the clock? All right, you're better at it than I am. Okay, so we're going to start with here, repatterning the future. So this is really the invitation, right? It's potentially moving from this old world to this new world. What would that look like as we imagine? Last year, if those of you were here, Worley gave one of the opening keynote talks. Worley is a good friend of mine from Austin. We've known each other for over 15 years. And in his talk, he asked the question, what would the world look like if it worked for everyone? Right? And that's really the invitation of the moment that we're in. And the question again is like, why repatterning? So here's, I think, a really interesting stat, right? I was born when there were half as many people on the planet. So if you imagine that most of what is like patterning the world that we're in right now was done when there were maybe like 1 billion people, 2 billion people on the planet, right? At one point, the biggest innovation was the telegraph. When the telegraph was invented, it was the first time that we were able to communicate across geographies in real time. anything that happened from a news story or from something that was timely. Until then, everything was really much more discrete and left in our own local communities, right? So that was a huge breakthrough. And again, many of the industrial era practices and beliefs and promises and myths that we've inherited are the ones that we should really question now, as we now are at 8 billion people on the planet, potentially going to 10, but maybe not, even 8, right, is a pretty significant number that are putting pressure on the systems that we have on the planet right now. And certainly we have huge, huge technological advances since then, as we're right now entering the beginning of the AI era. So it means that the way I talk about it in my work, right, old systems are breaking down. New systems have yet to be created. They're going to have a completely different shape and a different pattern, and we're standing in the middle in this idea of the liminal gap between what we know and what we don't, what is familiar and what isn't, what has a shape, again, that we can recognize, and what is headed into a shape that we cannot recognize yet. It will be more dynamic. It will be more fluid. It will certainly be changing in real time more. It will have potentially different kinds of timelines around all that, right? So how does it mean to be standing in this gap, right, in the middle of those two things, and how do we build capacity? The other way I describe it is I do not believe that we're headed into the fourth industrial revolution, which I know is controversial in Dubai. They have a whole center for the fourth industrial revolution. But what if we imagined that it was actually much bolder than that, right? If you think about all of these technologies that are advancing, converging in real time, what does that mean in terms of all the ways in which we'll restructure not just work or not just money or not just our built environment, but we think about all these things changing really, really dramatically as we move ahead. And this idea of what would you call this era, right? One way to describe it is the exponential productivity transformation, right? XPT. It's a phrase that will never catch on. I'm really clear on that. But for me, it is exponential. It is, at this point, we're thinking a lot about increased productivity and not just about being able to create more or build more, but being able to do more with less. And I really do think it is a transformation. And this is about how far along we are into it. Right? When you ask anybody how far along we are into this new era, anybody that's working in AI or in the metaverse or 3D printing and manufacturing, right? About how far along we think we are into this world that we can sense but we can't name yet, we're 1%. Really, really early days. So imagine again this caterpillar, right, that just starting this metamorphosis as we're heading into this and has no idea what it's going to be on the other side. But we have a choice around some of these things, right? What are the questions that we want to ask as we move forward? And so these are just some of the questions that we think about from a repatterning perspective, right? As a humanity, are we really, focused on greed and competition, and is that the way that we should be protecting and doing everything? Or are we actually really aligned for collaboration and caring? If you look at the mythology that has created some of this thinking on the left, right? If you look at chimpanzees, yes, they are very competitive. If you look at bonobos, they are not. Right? So even challenging some of the myths that created the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and about what we can do. Monika, I think, is going to jump into that and tell us a lot more about how the stories that we've been hearing impact what we believe or not believe around this. Right? Do we believe that we are safer in closed, centralized systems or in actually open, distributed systems? Huge issue when we start talking about the internet, certainly even when we're talking about resources and how we can navigate those. Are we also better served in rigid hierarchies? Right? Or in things that, again, are more fluid. I can't even read these things. Oh, in partnership systems, right? When we're working in much more collaborative systems, we're working in much more organic systems and ones that are emergent in real time. Are we, what is, again, is the healthier model? One that is very, very extractive, right? And focuses on a few, or one that is hopefully regenerative and focused on the many? Right? These are the opportunities again. Is innovation fueled faster by very homogenous teams that know each other very well, or by very diverse teams that can bring a bit of different kind of perspective to it? And what is the capacity that we would need to be able to work in those kinds of teams more effectively? Is, again, capacity that we're all building. Right? We love to talk about diversity and pluralistic, but we're not very good necessarily working in those systems. And potentially, again, when we think about growth, here's a really interesting thing, right? The old pattern is that you imagine something just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. The new pattern, if you can imagine, is about cellular growth, right? We can imagine that it's actually continuously growing. The DNA exists inside all the cells, but it can grow in a very, very different kind of configuration, potentially in more infinite ways and healthier ways, but it isn't trying to manage this thing through a really, really big bureaucracy. So these are just some of the questions. I'm sure you guys could come up with more. This is the work that I want to spend my 2025 really thinking about and writing about, so I would love any thoughts that you have. But the invitation really at the end is to move it not just from a productivity transformation, but a prosperity transformation, right? If we can really change the way that we pattern things, not just the way we think, but the way that we're actually patterning and building our systems, we have this opportunity to really build the world that Worley asked us about that works for everyone. So with that, I will transfer it to you, Ila Colombo, to talk about living systems, really, and how do living systems set up a pattern, right, for how we can think about our own lives, how we build things, how we move into that. So do you want to take us through some of your work, which is gorgeous? Like, I love the fact that you can paint a picture for us so viscerally about what it looks like.
Thank you, Zenzi, and amazing presentation. It's exciting to be talking about this topic today. So I wear many different hats, like many of us at the forum at the moment, but my work mostly is within the creative industries, design, architecture, digital fabrication, and recently AI research. And I try to combine everything together with my own passions as well in science, biology, and technology, and envision what the future can look like, but also how do we start building that. And one of the most fundamental questions that we face today as humans is, can the AI crisis, if there is one, help the climate crisis that we know exists? And a lot of the conversation going around those two topics, which I disagree in the way the lexicon is expressed, is not losing control or regaining control of nature. And I think it's not the right dynamic or the best way to express this. Like, we know that we cannot control nature, and in fact, we never controlled even our own selves. So if you look at consciousness, for example, the way we perceive our own bodies is only a microfracture of what actually our body computes. So the same way, technology, design, creativity can all merge together and expand our understanding of the world rather than helping us controlling it. So starting from a creativity perspective, my work involves researching those topics from the inception and the intention of what creation really means. So talking about the fourth industrial revolution, what industry means, but what designing means. And the reality is that we don't understand the majority of our world, and therefore we've been designing in it rather than with it. So rewriting the design and architectural practice, working with the natural world. This is something of just a speculative example of how can we harness electricity and light, not from an artificial synthetic perspective, but working in synergy with biohacking the natural world. And therefore, crafting visual memory from an architectural perspective of what the future can look like the moment we fully achieve symbiosis. Those are just speculative ideas and speculative designs, but really what my work involves is creating collective intelligence or a collective creativity can then foster innovation and technological progress today. So from a micro perspective of just what an object can look like or can do, all the way to our own built environment or grown environment. Power to decode communications that have been perceived as invisible or totally passive to us. Going back to consciousness and the user illusion, our body computes and processes 11 million bits of information every second, but we're only aware of 16 of them. The same way the natural world processes information, materials, and data constantly, what we see is only a microfraction. So AI can help us go deeper into this data set of knowledge and wisdom and co-create with the natural world. We can process and simulate millions of years of evolution with proteins. We can simulate what materials could look like and therefore create innovative solutions and more and better design habitats. So what does this mean in practice? It means moving from the Anthropocene, which we know as the evolutionary era of man-made things, to the Symbiocene, which is more life-centric design, therefore co-creating with nature and living in symbiosis with nature. A lot of the pictures of the future look incredibly gray, concrete-based, and detached from the wildlife, while in reality we need to have this back and forth feedback loop evolution with life itself. And then moving from biomimicry, which is a very known principle of designing inspired by natural principles, to adaptive engineering and bioreactive systems, and so on and so forth, and being able to really compute biological intelligence as such, and all the way to hybrid creativity and collective intelligence thanks to AI. So it's at a macro and macro level, but all in an holistic manner. Bringing in the youth, I'm very passionate. I'm a mother of a little girl, 3 years old. I'm very passionate about how do we bring the youth into perspective of this as well, because someone in the opening speeches yesterday said that Gen Alpha are going to be potentially the people of today, but the people of tomorrow as well, as far as we're concerned, declining birth rates and so on. It means those are the people that are going to inhabit, design, and create the future. So we need to have them part of the conversation since a young age. So if you look at what artificial intelligence can do today is augment and extend our level of cognition. That means that we have kids that can comprehend and work with thermodynamics at age 5 potentially, because they're able to visualize and understand almost at an anatomical cellular level what those rules of the physical world imply. And therefore achieving the ultimate human, all the way from philosophers and thinkers like Nietzsche, the superhuman. All of these are speculations, or Maxwell's demon of the thermodynamics. Those are things that can be real. So the human of the future and our kids will be able to comprehend and understand the world at level of extension that were unimaginable before, and therefore really craft something exponentially beautiful.
And empowered, I think, in a really significant way. Again, I've taken a clip of Worley's talk from last year, if any of you guys heard about citizen scientists, and the impact that a 9 or 10 or 11-year-old will be able to have, because the process will be more around prompting than it will be around having to know the deep science of something or the deep tech of something, right? Or just the imagination. So the more that we can fill that little body with curiosity, and we just saw in the last panel about the future of education and the empowerment around that, I just think it's super exciting to see. And your visuals are the thing that I think have always excited me, because you show a picture of the future that looks so different than what it is that we have been patterned to believe that the future is most likely going to be looking like, right?
Yeah, there are many ways of visualizing the future. There are so many different visions of the future, and only if we open source this collective discourse, we can achieve to something that satisfies the many. But if you look at prompting, for example, we should go back to natural language. Like anything that is a skill set based manual or non-manual way of working, it's just about there to be automated. So we should go back to thinking and visualizing and dreaming rather than specializing into something. Like prompting is already replaced.
Right.
Yeah.
Fair. So again, we go back to how do the stories have impacted what it is that we believe is possible about the future. In the opening keynote, one of the opening plenaries this morning, they were doing world building and talking about at one point they were trying to create a world that had positive imagery of what the future looked like, and they didn't have enough material to work with. That's because they have not spent enough time with you yet, Monika, because you have the ways in which we can think about this world much more differently. So take us through it.
Well, funny enough, Liam has spent some time with me. I have actually lectured at SciArc, and that inspired quite a bunch of students to work on more Protopian ideas. I'm Monika Bielskyte. I'm a futurist, speculative designer, and founder of Protopia Futures, as well as recently joined as a partner an amazing project called African Life-Centered Design, based out of Johannesburg, South Africa. So today, the narrative of fear is dominating, right? It's filtering into our media, into policy making, and it leads to the sort of rise of extremist discourse. And we talk still about misinformation and how people fall for misinformation, but it's much worse than that. People fall for strategic disinformation and hybrid warfare techniques. It is the point to make people feel that nothing is true and everything is possible. And because we cannot make sense of things and we are losing our scientific literacy, we're not developing greater scale population resilience for information literacy and scientific literacy and technological literacy, people feel that there's nothing we can do about the future. And then the fear narrative wins. And we know when our choices are being dominated by fear, we don't make the best choices. So how do we resist these extremist narratives and challenge this idea of doom and gloom and actually design gradually for a livable future? And understand that it is a really difficult task, and it will take us many generations. Something that interferes with that is sci-fi narratives and how they have bled into reality. So much of the stuff that we were told is futuristic that has supposedly opened our imaginations, in fact, has misdirected us and led us the wrong pathways. It's really important to reconsider what we've been told is and is not future-worthy. It's really important to reconsider that it's really not tech gazillionaires of the world that are the most influential people in shaping the future, but that them, as little boys, as teenagers, they picked up a particular sci-fi narrative, be it a sci-fi book or movie or TV series, and their imagination ended up being ossified in that outdated vision of the past. And oftentimes, not just socially, culturally, politically outdated vision of the past, but even scientifically outdated vision of the past. So I say it always starts with a story. It starts with a vision. And it's those that control the fantasy that end up controlling the future. We inhabiting somebody else's fantasy, and it's about time for us to start creating ours. Every historical utopia has been built on somebody else's dystopia. These visions are profoundly disempowering. Dystopia is no more a cautionary tale, but really becomes a product roadmap. Some of the world's most talented artists, concept designers, directors, utilizing their talent to give great ideas to terrible people, to make money, not just as the world burns, but by setting the world on fire, right? And then we get offered utopia. But we know that utopias have always been top-down, mired in exclusions of marginalized peoples. In a way, if disabled people still exist, is it even utopia? Do we need to exterminate disabled people so we would achieve this utopia of perfection? I say we have to challenge that. We have to push back at nostalgia, but also refuse techno-fetishism. Technology is not some kind of magical panacea unless we address these foundational issues. Those solutions will be just like a plaster in the crack in the concrete. They'll fail us over the long term. How do we know how to work towards these livable futures? I say we have to embrace not these top-down visions of the most privileged, because privilege ends up insulating us from the consequences of our actions. We need to lean into the visceral knowledge of the consequences and impact of those that live at a bleeding edge of harm. And that will benefit most of us, not all of us, because there are the beneficiaries of the status quo that is destructive and harming the majority of us. So let's lean into leadership of the most impacted and design with, not for. So I say, we have to defy these escapist narratives. The idea that there's always another frontier and that somehow now space colonialism is going to be this deus ex machina, where we're going to be able to continue consuming. That undermines our very own selves. When we talk about we need to save the planet, we are deluding ourselves. 99% of DNA within our bodies is our microbiome. We're not just cutting the branch upon which we're sitting, we're cutting our own head. We don't need to save the world, we need to save ourselves. Life-centric design benefits humanity, right? To decenter humans doesn't mean that humans are the virus and we need to go post-human or transhuman. It's actually for our own benefit. Inclusive vision, centering the experiences that have never been voiceless or silent, but purposely excluded. And using technology, not as a magical answer, not something AI is going to do this or VR is going to do this, but we can achieve those things utilizing these tools. And these tools are very imperfect right now. And it's much harder to achieve positive things with it. And yet it's very easy to use them for destructive capacity. So it's only if we focus on inclusive vision and think of technological tools as something of assistive capacity that we can start moving towards livable, aka protopian future. Protopia is not some kind of vanilla center vision between utopia and dystopia. It is a vision beyond. It's not true that there's no answer to the future. There have been those visions. We just have been purposely excluded from seeing them. So, here are a few principles. Not enough time to talk about it. take a screenshot. Hopefully next year we can dive deeper. But what's important is that nothing is more important than the other. We have to move past this hierarchical thinking of Maslow's pyramid hierarchy of needs, where we can only start thinking about our need for creativity or spirituality or community or embodiment when we have solved these practical issues. No, all these things are interlinking circles that support each other. Unless we think of it together and work on it together because of our differences, because of our plurality, we'll never reach that point of livable future. And it's not going to be an easy journey, but that's why we have to do it. What we have to do is start celebrating the process of learning, not being right. Thank you.
See why I get to spend all this time with the femme futurists that I really am inspired by, because you guys make it feel much less scary as I move into the future and give me examples that I can show other people about how we move here. Interestingly, about Maslow's hierarchy, even, first of all, he never created the pyramid, right? Somebody else did. But his work was actually based on spending some time with indigenous tribes for whom self-actualization actually wasn't at the top. It was community actualization that was. You actually started with self-actualization from the sense of really knowing yourself, and then moved into community actualization, or whatever you want to call it, communal. And the idea that the wealthiest person in the tribe was the person who gave the most away. So it's like, again, just challenging these myths about what it is that we believe about how humans are and how we're supposed to work and how this is all supposed to look. I think it's such an important part of the moment that we're in. What were you going to say?
Oh, truly not the first time when a white man appropriated indigenous knowledge and profoundly misunderstood it in the process of appropriation.
But no, but this is where we're heading back to. This is the part that I think is so exciting when we start to talk about what does it mean to repattern. I went to a session at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas a few years ago, and it was like one of the smaller ones that was like in this tiny little conference room. But it was two indigenous women from two different tribes that were talking about how they were working to save waterways and the sort of the contentious meetings that they'd had both within their tribes but also with other communities. But every single meeting that they started with a whole ritual in which they called in the north, the south, the east, and the west. They spent time together. They had a moment of sort of whatever the deep connection was. I forgot they had their whole protocol, but as they went into it, then the meeting was just a very different meeting. And I thought, wow, how can we repattern what meetings look like, right? We're trying to have meetings these days that just have 5 minutes where we connect and say, hey, how are you? Hey, and what's going on for you, right? And people think that's inefficient, and what we're finding is in all the research, right, if you can spend 5 minutes just actually having a real connection with someone, what that does in terms of changing the productivity of the rest of the work. So you imagine now if we could really lift that veil and go into much deeper spiritual practice with each other to have some of these really fascinating conversations. All right, so as we start to move into, that's just some of the examples, right? How do we make this sound real? One of the examples that I have, and I talk to people about repatterning the future, and I was in Nairobi where I got to meet Iman for the first time, and my friend Thomas. We were talking to young entrepreneurs. They were like 18 to 25 years old, and they were really super excited about what they were building and the hustle to get to a unicorn. I'm like, well, why are we going for a unicorn, right? What we're finding is that Silicon Valley pattern of, again, if I need to get to take as much money in to be able to have 10 times an exit so that I can become $1 billion business is actually considered pretty somewhat outdated and very extractive. There's this other model of the zebra. They're like, what's a zebra? And you start talking about the fact that zebras versus unicorns are a very different pattern. If you Google it, zebras, the headline is, unicorns aren't real, zebras are. But the idea is they're built with a sense of sustainability and circular supply chain. They're thinking a lot more about communal. They're not thinking about how you take in so much money to be able to have a 10 times exit. It's a much more reasonable growth pattern. It's thinking about this over long term versus short term, just a whole different way of thinking about it. So that's one of the examples that I have. I think about that again when we think about money and the future of money. We think about that even when we think about time, that we should be moving out of this rigid industrial clock to thinking much more about rhythms and rituals. In both our workday and our work week and our lives. So those are some of my examples. And you guys think about repatterning. Where do you want to jump in? And you talk about test creel and the fact that there's a Silicon Valley way in which we think we're supposed to be building what the future looks like. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah. So one of the points within Protopia Future Design Framework was our spiritual needs. And that's a topic that also came up in one of the morning sessions today. And we talk a lot about smart cities, connected cities, and that is a reality that, of course, we need to solve for. I'm based in Johannesburg, South Africa. we've been going through load shedding, cuts of electricity, water shortages, we're pioneering what's going to happen in so many other parts of the world. And we're also pioneering the solutions, right? Which is, again, an example how the future is not going to happen in the cities that were labeled as futuristic, sort of Copenhagen's and Oslo's and Amsterdam's. If the future is going to happen, it's going to happen in the cities of the global south. So we need to even rethink the models, right? First world, third world, developed, underdeveloped world, really? Should, like how, racially structured those categories are, or how delusional is this idea that somehow the underdeveloped world should follow the model of developed world. We know that the issue is not overpopulation, it is overconsumption. So if we all follow that same model of development, not only we're not going to be unsustainable, I mean, it's absolutely an unrealistic vision of the world. At the same time, we need to understand that reality of geopolitics and economy exists. So if we just dream of this, happy regenerative future, but we don't take into account the realities of hybrid warfare, the realities of economic structures, we'll be just dreaming away and not reckoning with, the real world that we live in. If we hate one particular military-industrial complex and we just want to destroy it, but all of the other military-industrial complexes exist, then we create that power vacuum that will be usurped by something even more dangerous. So what's interesting for me is when we talk about future cities, we need to talk about the reality of the cities. And what is the role not just of productivity and connectivity, but how do we actually live in them? How do we belong in them? How we focus on practicalities, but we also think, well, what is the role of creativity? What is the role of play? What is the role of spirituality? How cities are not just smart, but wise. How they're also beautiful and playful, and how we can feel that real sense of belonging. And what happens when we don't take these things into account? We create a vacuum of creativity, creative expression, of spirituality, and it tends to be usurped by ultimately fascism. And that's what's been happening with the tech bros of Silicon Valley. A lot of these people were raised in very conservative religious backgrounds, Mormons, evangelicals, etc., and then became virulently atheist. And then they realized, well, some kind of meaning is missing out of their lives. And so they AGI, they will be the ones that will birth this God. They'll be the ones that will develop these humanoid robots so that they would not need women. Ultimately, it's about that, right? So TESCRAIL is this weird emergent ideology, transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, effective altruism, long-termism. There's much more you can read about it by Timnit Gebru and Emil P. Torres. But essentially, it's this idea that life on this planet, this earth, our physical bodies, not just are obsolete, they should be rendered obsolete for this more grand cosmic vision. There's been also super interesting writing by Nesha Devenot that explores the relationship between sort of this sci-fi technological new emergent form of ultimately religion, and how psychedelics play into that, and how a bunch of these people that love sci-fi took way too much ketamine, too much acid. Elon Musk is a great example of that, and started having these delusional visions of grandeur, that they and only they have the answer for all of us. And all of us should just shut up and follow the program.
Right.
And this is incredibly dangerous, and that's why we need to challenge these fences, and that's why it's so important to think, well, what is our healthy relationship with spirituality, with creativity, that doesn't try to replace life, but that supports life, that makes us more alive and more connected, not just with each other, but with our own bodies and with all life here on Earth.
Well, this is why I keep going back to and this is why I have been preaching for a long time that if we take whatever that industrial way of thinking and then put it on steroids, right, bring it into this exponential future, this is what you start to see, right? It's just becomes so much more extractive and so much more concentrated, right? He who holds the algorithm will have a tremendous amount of power, and that's where this is all going right now. So when we think about this in terms of what capitalism looks like, what patriarchy looks like, what extractivism looks like, right? What are all these things that we can challenge and look at a different way? So what are your favorite examples when you start to talk to people about what this could look like? What's something tangible?
Yeah, well, it's difficult to follow after Monika because it was so inspiring on so many levels. But just taking upon the spirituality and the connectivity and the feeling of being grounded, basically. I think this is something that we deeply need to go back, and going back to our own instinct in terms of survival instincts, but also understanding and being aware of what's going on around us. I mean, from a natural perspective, because I'm here mostly representing the natural principles and the natural world in a way, and how does this come through to fabrication and making. Obviously, there's so much that we don't know, but we can tap on to achieve that. But one of the most important factors behind the why, if you say, we're facing, obviously, a lot of problems from a political standpoint of view, from an economic standpoint of view, from a material standpoint of view. That's the biggest challenge of them all. So if you want to reference degradation and waste management and production, those are massive issues that we still haven't solved, although we could, that are extremely impactful on the why we should repattern the world, and therefore rewrite what success really means beyond profitability, beyond GDP, as was mentioned also yesterday.
Exactly. That's a great
In 2020, something really unexpected happened, and I'm not talking about COVID, as we all know, but also for the first time in history, the anthropomass surpassed the biomass. That means everything made by us is quantifiable as more than anything natural. Every single one of us produces our own body weight of stuff every week. If you continue at this increase of rate, by 2040, we're going to triple the amount of living things on Earth. So the trajectory is really scary, and therefore...
man-made things, right? Triple the amount of...
biomass. Right. That is anything living, from plants to wildlife to soil, anything that is quantified as Earth, made versus human-made.
Right. Human-made will outpace that 3 to 1.
Yeah, concrete, materials, anything that is natural of nature, which is incredibly scary, obviously.
Right.
So repatterning the future means advocating with a new terminology, a new philosophy behind what success really means. Our current systems are not rewarding contribution in a nature-friendly way. In nature, nothing goes to waste. Every single life is incredibly meaningful and purposeful. It's a recycling circular loop. What we do, we waste, we don't use, we don't reuse. And we obviously reward profitability versus revenue making and so on and so forth, when in fact we should go back to rewarding meritocracy, exchange, value within a society. What does value really mean? How is an individual considered valuable to a community? So all of those things go back to any level you want, from educational to political to societal, and AI coming into play. How can we use technology not just as a tool, but as an extension of our own value systems? So this is the things that we're really interested in.
Now I want to jump into that. Do you guys have anybody else have questions as we jump in and we think about? We just want to keep hearing. Oh yeah. Please, we have microphones that are going to come along. I'm just curious to see what this is provoking for you all as you start to imagine, right, repatterning, and what are the various places we could imagine.
Are there examples that exist today of investors that do focus mainly on sustainability and things that aren't totally extractive, and still allow them to maintain some sort of margin, some sort of return? The venture model, which we all know has flaws, also has a pattern where you say, okay, well, 9 out of 10 are going to go bust, and the one that goes to the moon is going to solve the sins of the rest. Who today invests in things that maybe gets a 10% return, not a 10x return, but is consistent enough that they can maintain some preservation of capital?
I think there are plenty of examples of that. It's interesting from a startup perspective versus ongoing businesses that are like that, right? You look at someone like IKEA. Like we can sit there and say they're super consumptive, and maybe that's greenwashing, but they really are thinking about this from a 400-year lens, not just a next quarter lens, right? And so thinking about that, they got rid of their catalog, right? That was one of these things that was like so important to them, and yet somehow they got rid of their catalog and were able to still make plenty of money doing it their way. They are able to put wind farms and invest in all kinds of things. So you would argue, okay, that's one way of looking at it. One of my favorite examples in the US is Costco, which is a big, giant, big box retailer, but always ends up as like one of the most profitable and also takes care of its people better than almost any other company does, right? So this idea that I can't take care of employees, I need to make sure that I get to the bottom line, is definitely an old way of thinking. But when you think about it from a startup perspective or new companies, what inspires you?
Yeah, so I've joined this collective post-growth institute, but I'm very, very critical of degrowth discourse because, Western industrialized nations, they benefited, from all the industrial processes, and now they want to control everybody else. So I think we have to be living in a sort of realistic world of the future, and I don't think it will be easy for us to move past economy of growth. However, we could direct the growth in a different trajectory. All right? So right now, our growth is primarily predicated on the growth of the extractive process, taking what we label as natural resources that have never been natural resources for us to utilize, right? Turning them into products, turning them into waste, right? That is not at all approaching how life cycle works, where growth is this constant process of transformation. But what I think we could do if we refocused our growth, catering to the basic needs of everybody and making sure that nations that have benefited the most from these processes support the nations that need to transition towards regenerative practices. But I think there's so much opportunity for growth if we move past from material growth in a finite world towards areas where infinite growth is possible. And that is economy of knowledge. That is economy of experience. That is economy of innovation. There, the growth can be infinite. So I think it's about shifting what is the main engine of our economy away from materiality towards something that ultimately makes our lives worth living. And things is not what makes our lives worth living. There's a certain amount of things that we need to live our lives well, but past that, it's not really what makes life worth it. So, and we need to focus more on that. And whenever we draw any future plans for future cities, we need to really ask, well, what is part of knowledge economy? What is part of experience economy that is being considered as crucial part of its innovation strategy?
Well, and I'll just add to that again, then what is the role of the corporation or business in that? Because I think that's really part of the question that we've got right now, which is how do we pattern business so that they are bigger contributors to the overall society as opposed to potentially, again, the industrial era created tremendous amount of goods and services, lifted a bunch of people out of poverty. On one level, you would say it was very, very successful. It also threw off a whole bunch of externalities that are not included in any of the accounting, right? So environmental and ecological degradation, certainly income inequality, and our own physical and mental well-being is taking a hit. So the question becomes, what is the true cost accounting? We start to imagine what is a company that's really profitable, and we start to look at this in the future. I think that's the kind of conversation we'll have when we start to imagine what does profitability look like, right? So it's not what are the returns, but the returns when you look at the full accounting of what was
If I can add a little note
yep.
on that.
Do we have another question over here?
I just, this kind of ties to the question that was asked and already the conversation that's happening, but when you said the new era of productivity, something, just rubbed me the wrong way.
The era of what, sorry?
You were talking about the era of exponential productivity growth, right?
Okay,
and I know you said you're against that, and I hear you. And I think Monika's touching on it a little bit too, with how can we repattern what productivity is? You were mentioning knowledge and experience. I'm thinking in my head cultural things like that. But I wonder if you can maybe just quickly talk about some words or some genres of ideas that are around this. Like, how do we repattern what the idea of productivity is?
Right.
Degrowth and slow growth and these things are already there. Are there any more that we might not know about?
Yeah, and we always think about we're thriving and flourishing, and we were having this whole conversation about whether or not we're just we have prosperity fatigue, right? One of the things that Monika was challenging on us when we were creating the name for this, or the question for this, is like, are people sick of talking about equity and they're talking about prosperity? Like, what is the language, or what is a way in which we can invite people into one that it just feels, what are words that you love better? I mean, unfortunately, I do want an equitable future, right? I do want a sustainable future. I do want a life-centric future. I do want one in which everyone has a chance to have their basic needs met. And I think a lot about what are the economic structures that would allow us to be able to take all this lift in productivity and be able to distribute them more effectively. What does that look like, and what is the name for that? So,
yeah. So both communism and capitalism had a profound hatred, I don't think that's too big of a word, for disability, and attempted to exterminate disability and disabled people. And so I think disability inclusion and indigenous worldview inclusion is crucial to reimagine what productivity is about. Disability and disability justice movement really challenge us to think about productivity differently, because it makes not independence, what is always illusionary, you know? We're born needing others, and unless we die a sudden death, we will need others again in our lifetimes many times. So our greatest strength lies not in this fictional aspirational independence, but interdependence. And how can we show up for each other and be valuable in society on a very different measure than better, stronger, faster? What's interesting about it is also this notion of better, stronger, faster, us making ourselves into more robot-like things, is completely unsustainable in the age of automation and artificial intelligence. All of that stuff that used to be most aspirational, from the prettiest faces to the fittest bodies, that can be automated away. And so I think centering disability justice and disability inclusion and all that we can learn from that is really crucial. And it's really vital because sort of that neo-eugenics discourse is really arising. It's rearing its ugly head again with techno-utopian sort of vision of the future. So for me, I think that is crucial, and that constantly gets forgotten whenever we imagine hopeful futures. We think somehow we need to make disability disappear, and I think it is the contrary. And I love this idea of beginning of human civilization is when we found the skeletons of the first person that had a broken femur. And the community of that person took care of them. And that's the beginning of human civilization. I think that's a much more interesting story that doesn't get told enough, and I want that to be a story of our future.
And I will add to that there's a work by Riane Eisler, who wrote a book called The Real Wealth of Nations, that talks a lot about partnership systems, or partnerism. So this like contrast to communism versus socialism, and whether or not we can like kind of duke it out, this idea of what would partnerism look like, where it's really based on a caring community and collaboration. Again, unpaid care work, just period, is not even included in any of our economic measures, which is why we're again in such a distorted system right now. It is crazy that we've run out of time. Like, we already hit it. Like, that is like, again, I'm just going to tell you, like, time and I have a very challenging relationship. I always want it to be more expansive. So I just want to so quickly say thank you, Ila. Is there any closing thought that you want to add to it?
Actually, one that links both questions, going back to the impact investors and productivity. I think if we look at the natural world, there's a lot to do with efficiency. And at the moment, the view of globalization and distribution as a unified system doesn't really work.
Exactly.
So going back to decentralize the impact within the reach, so it's closer to you, you have more productivity because it's near you and you can make a real impact. So diversifying whatever, it's the solution. Having smaller units, more regional, localized, systemic action is the solution, and therefore you're going to be more efficient, you're going to be more resourceful, you can concentrate.
More responsive.
Yeah, responsible. Yeah. And with all of those going on together, you have an holistic, healthy world.
Right. Thank you, guys. I'm sorry that we went so long, but thank you for sticking with us. Thank you, guys, so very much. Hopefully this has left you with a bit more hope as we go to the closing session. Thank you.
Thank you.